Hi, on this video we're going to show you the most relevant events on physical and human geography from 1936 to 1970.
In this video, we are going to show the most relevant event on physical and human geography during the 20th century. Our world suffered a lot of changes, but in this case, we're just focusing on Asia, Europe, and America, where the most powerful countries such as China, USSR, Germany, and USA are located. Some of these events are still affecting our world.
Starting with the death of Queen Victoria in 1901. And on the same year, Hiroshima from Japan was born. The next year, Woodrow Wilson became president of Princeton. The following year, in 1903, with Panama's independence from Colombia. On the same year, the Acre War took place in America, when Acre is ceded by Bolivia to Brazil.
1 year later, in 1904, the Russo-Japanese War made a great impact in Asia. In 1905, the Treaty of Portsmouth was created. This treaty gives Japan control of Port Arthur and many of Liaotung Peninsula.
A year later in Beijing, Hui was born, and he is going to be the last emperor of China. In 1910, Francisco I. Madero was the head of the anti-eleccionista party. In 1912, Emperor Meiji from Tokyo dies.
In 1914, the European powers erupted and World War I began. This was because the assassination of Francis in Austria.
On the same year, 1914, Russia was home for the Jews. About 5.3 million Jews migrated to Russia.
2 years later, in Asia, Mao Zedong, leader of that delegation, created the first Congress of the Chinese Communist Party in Shanghai. In 1917, the Treaty of Danish West Indies took place in America.
A year later, in 1918, the total number of military and civilian casualties in World War I was more than 38 million. In 1919, the Treaty of Versailles was signed. Germany takes the fault of all the damage created during World War I. And on the same year, Theodore Roosevelt died. In 1922, also in Europe, Russia ceased to be an independent state after the murder of Nicholas II. The following year, 1923, Miguel Primo de Rivera from Spain did a coup d'etat and dissolved the parliament and started a dictatorship. Privy Council of the United Kingdom established the boundaries of the Dominion of Newfoundland and Canada in 1927. In 1931, about 6 million Russian peasants died because they were transported to Siberian labor camps. 2 years later, Hitler became chancellor. Thanks to this, the Jew persecution increased. Starting with Mussolini in 1936, when he signs a friendly pact with Hitler and later on dies on 1945. A year later, in 1937, the Sino-Japanese War began, lasting 8 years. Later on, in 1939, World War II breaks out when Germany invades Poland. As a response, Italy and Japan support Germany and are against Great Britain. 2 years later, Mexico supported and had a role on World War II during 4 years. President Li from China, who resigned the same year as appointed, dies in 1943. In 1945, Occupation Zone Germany by Allied forces started, where Germany is divided in 4 military occupational zones. In the same year, there were over 500,000 military American deaths because of the war. The same year as the war ended, a lot of leaders died, like Hitler, who dies in Berlin supposedly committing suicide, Philippe Pétain, who is sentenced to life in prison, and Franklin Roosevelt. A year later, in 1946, Hideki Toho was taken by the Americans, and 2 years later he was hanged. 2 years after, in 1948, USA began creating a voluntary agencies responsible for European refugees. In 1950, European immigrants continued arriving in South American countries. And 1 year later, about 160,000 Polish refugees were settled in Britain. Looking up to Asia, in the same year, 1951, the Treaty of San Francisco was signed, a treaty of peace with Japan. 2 years later, the boundary between North Korea and South Korea is a military demarcation line, which roughly follows the previous 38th parallel. In 1954, the United States, France, Great Britain, New Zealand, Australia, the Philippines, Thailand, and Pakistan formed the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization. Manuel Avila Camacho, who was the Mexican president from 1940 to 1946, dies in 1955. 2 years later, in 1957, President Chiang Kai shek, who was a Chinese politician, tried to take Taiwan. Moving on to 1961, the Soviet Union builds a wall to isolate West Berlin, also known as the Berlin Wall. A year later, in 1962, the India-China War takes place in Asia. 7 years later, in Mexico, the Tlatelolco massacre took place, where the government fired a crowd of student protesters. The 49th president of Mexico, Lázaro Cárdenas, dies in 1970. In the same year, 1970, Brazil had a huge increasement on their population, which surpassed 90 million people.
The Five Power Defense Arrangements are a series of ongoing defense agreements between Singapore, Malaysia, Australia, New Zealand, and the United Kingdom.
The same year, Gustavo Díaz Ortiz takes the position of ambassador in Spain after his presidency ends in 1970 in Mexico, with Francisco Franco in the power.
Years later, British Honduras is renamed Belize,
with George Cattle Priest becoming their primer.
On the same year, in 1973, the Bahamas is now independent from the United Kingdom.
A year later in the USA, Richard Nixon resigns as president on August 1974.
South Vietnam and the North Vietnam were officially unified as Vietnam.
The independence of Dominica from the United Kingdom is also achieved in 1978.
On the same year, the Treaty of Peace and Friendship between Japan and China is signed by Huang Hua and Sandao Sonoda. The following year, 1979, China invaded Vietnam and occupied the disputed territories along the border.
In the same year, Saint Lucia also achieved its independence from the United Kingdom. In 1985, the Falkland Islands, disputed by the United Kingdom under the rule of Queen Elizabeth and Argentina, became a separate territory known as the South Georgia and the South Sandwich Islands.
4 years later, the Berlin Wall falls and most communist governments of Eastern Europe fall, and like this, ending the Cold War.
And Richard von Weizsäcker re-elected.
In 1991, the Soviet Union is dissolved and its states become independent.
The day after, Mikhail Gorbachev resigns as president.
The following year, 1992, the Treaty of Maastricht creates the European Union out of the European Economic Community. Ending in 1997, when Britain returns its colony of Hong Kong to China.
Jiang Zemin as president of China. This ended the British Empire.
Through all these events, we can see the physical and the human geographical changes our world faced, with the beginning of World War I, its consequence of a Great Depression, then World War II, and as a consequence, the Cold War, as well as people who were a crucial part of these events, causing them of stopping them. A lot of geographical movements were also made thanks to wars, treaties, etc. With this, we end the most important events during the 20th century.